who's thanks, Harim, and thanks to everyone who's taken the time to join us tonight. I am, for the most part, really going to speak about the situation up until October 6th, let's say, or the kind of much broader, more the historical context more broadly. I'm going to share my presentation and hope this. All right, so hopefully you're seeing what I'm seeing. So I want to focus first of all on a bit of a framework, which is to talk about the crime of apartheid and how it applies to the state of Israel. And I do this partly also because I want to take the opportunity to talk about the South African liberation struggle and about European colonialism in South Africa, because I feel like much of that has been effectively whitewashed. The struggle in South Africa was an anti-colonial liberation movement. And I think the fixation on nonviolence has meant that, you know, someone like Nelson Mandela, who was the head of the armed wing of the ANC, is somehow kind of remembered as exclusively as just a symbol of nonviolence, rather than thinking about the decades of struggle against a quite brutal system of colonialism in South Africa. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word. In 1948, the election where the voters were only the white settlers, brought in a nationalist party that effectively instituted a set of laws building on the existing British colonial laws that they used the Afrikaans word for apartness to name apartheid. Part of that system, geographically speaking at least, sort of developed. So in the 70s, it really came to light just how much the South African regime had a democracy problem. You had a 90% of the population that did not have the vote. This is the indigenous, the black part of the population, and was denied the vote in their own land. And the solution that the South African apartheid regime came up with for this was to carve out about 13% of the territory of South Africa in this map that you see, and effectively to create this half dozen or so states that they called the homelands. And you can see them as the colored parts of the map, the not white parts of the map. So you can see that they're not even mostly contiguous. So Bophuthatswana is these sort of 5 or 6 different islands. And the idea was to sort of move the black population physically, but also legally in terms of their citizenship, and say that they are citizens of these other countries, and to kind of pass off these other countries as independent states. And so that 90% of the population would be citizens of these other states and would thereby solve South Africa's apartheid democracy problem, because that 10% of the settler, that 10% of the population that was the settler population became 100% of the official population. So I hope I said that clearly. But this was the idea of the homelands. And actually the South African regime really kind of campaigned quite relentlessly to get these other states recognized, these homelands recognized as states by other countries. And the South African liberation movement fought this tooth and nail. So the ANC, the Communist Party, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, they effectively ensured that no country in the world recognized any of the homelands. The only exception was that Bophuthatswana, that one in the north, opened up an embassy in Tel Aviv. So Israel was the only country to recognize one of these. In South Africa, well, sorry, now there's a lot of similarities between South Africa, the South African apartheid regime, and the Israeli apartheid regime. They're both settler colonial regimes. There's little things like the South African army was called the South African Defense Force. The Israeli army is called the Israeli Defense Force. This 13% of the land that was zoned as, kind of like the places to corral the indigenous population into, it's 13% of Palestine that constitutes the landmass that Palestinians are being squeezed into since the 90s, especially. But I want to focus on the differences. So in the case of South Africa, you actually would have had a very difficult time as a Black person getting a visa, an exit visa, to leave South Africa. The main purpose of the apartheid regime, because apartheid isn't an end in itself, it's a means to something. In the case of South Africa, apartheid was very much a means to exploiting the Black population's labor. So this is what made South Africa the most powerful economy on the African continent, was the fact that by having these effectively reserves, these open air mega prisons to warehouse the indigenous population, this effectively created a cheap labor force, people kind of living in extreme poverty who would be willing to work in the mines and in the different industries that made South Africa such a powerful economy under the apartheid regime. And it also made workers very easily replaceable. So that kind of kept wages extremely, extremely low. In the case of Israel, the point is not to, I mean, they've exploited Palestinian labor in many, many, many different ways over the decades. But the point has always been to kind of wipe out the Palestinian presence in Palestine. And we can see this from the very beginnings of the idea that brings Israel about. So I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I do want to note that apartheid in the mid-1970s, after the Soweto uprising, the international community passed a law called the International Convention for the Suppression and Punishment for of the Crime of Apartheid, which defined apartheid much along the definition of genocide. So if one group establishes or commits human rights violations with the intention of establishing and or maintaining a regime of domination by one group over other groups, that is the crime of apartheid. It's the Genocide Convention basically defines genocide as a human rights violation where the intention is the extermination of the other group. So they're very similar kinds of crimes. It's just a difference of intent. And some people will say, well, apartheid was really just about South Africa. But well after the end of political apartheid in South Africa, so after the 1994 elections, as late as 2000, when the Rome Statute, or 2002, when the Rome Statute is passed, which is the statute that creates the International Criminal Court, the crime of apartheid is brought back in as a crime against humanity with the same kind of definition that we saw in the 1976 Apartheid Convention. So just to say that any state can commit the crime of apartheid. It is a crime against humanity under international criminal law. And so what is this question of intent and human rights violations? To look at intent, we actually have to understand the founding ideology of Israel, which is Zionism. And to understand Zionism, we have to understand the history of Jewish responses to anti-Semitism in Europe, because this is very much a European phenomenon, where you have centuries of anti-Semitism, centuries of discrimination against Jews. Something very important happens at the beginning of the 1800s with the French Revolution. There's this feeling that people are now citizens of states. This is a very modern phenomenon where you feel a certain equality before the law, because before this, it was more a feeling of being a subject to a monarch. And so you had a much more basic way of having kind of discrimination enacted on the population and on the society, very much based on things like class and gender, but also ethnic groups and religious groups. With the French Revolution, there's this idea that no, now these are states, these are liberal democracies, every citizen is entitled to the same rights. And you also have this kind of Jewish efflorescence, this intellectual boom in 19th century Europe of Jewish thinkers, and a lot of them very radical. And then you have, in the 1880s and 90s, this moment where, this moment of betrayal. Basically, a major landmark event is this, what's called the Dreyfus Affair, where you have a Jewish officer in the French army wrongly accused of treason, that radicalizes many young, predominantly secular Jews, especially in Western Europe. The idea being that, wait a second, weren't we supposed to be citizens with equal rights? How is anti-Semitism just so vilely alive and well? and uh, there's basically a new response now that there's this feeling that the notion of equality and citizenship is a hoax, that it's not real. Anti-Semitism is allowed to flourish, and you have state-level violence against Jewish communities and Jewish individuals for their Judaism. So very much systematic discrimination, that there needs to be a response. The predominant response within Jewish communities in Europe was what is now kind of called assimilationism. So the idea that, well, let's just try to blend in, duck your head and hope they don't notice that you're Jewish, and just try to be part of the broader society and not stand out. Something that I can very much relate to, because this is the kinds of things my parents told me and my siblings when we first immigrated, and it's very much an immigrant experience of just like, try not to rock the boat, try not to stick out too much. With Zionism, there was a new idea for how to solve anti-Semitism. And this was an idea that was based on a lot of very modern ideas. So the primary one was the idea of nationalism, that the world is divided into kind of discrete communities of people based on national identity. It's not about kind of whether you're part of a religion or not, so whether you're a Christian or a heathen or whatnot, but it's kind of national, what we now think of as national groups, and that each national group is entitled to a piece of territory that would be their state. This is the nation state. And so the main ideologues and leaders behind Zionism and participants in the early Zionist movement, it was a very small movement initially, effectively redefined Judaism from a religious identity into one that was also a national identity, and said that the solution to anti-Semitism is effectively to have, as is the most radical form of nationalism, to have a pure national Jewish state, right? So the idea is that the way that we combat anti-Semitism is we need to create a state that's for Jews only. And this is not unique to Jewish nationalism. Many nationalisms across the world, and especially in Europe, had strands that thought in these kinds of this language of pureness and purity. And so Zionism is very much part of that radical nationalist tradition. In his book on this, Theodor Herzl, who's considered the father of political Zionism, he wrote a book called Der Judenstaat, which means the state of the Jews, or the Jewish state. He draws a picture of what this utopia would look like, which is effectively that the sex worker is Jewish, the policeman who arrests her is Jewish, the prison guard is Jewish, the judge is Jewish, right? So it's that we have a regular kind of the same society we see around us now, but everyone is, but it's Jews only. Now, there was no way that they were going to be able to create a Jewish state in Europe, and they recognized this immediately. There was no way you would just go to, for example, Germany and say, give us Bavaria, or go to Britain and say, give us Yorkshire. But what there was, this is a time when about 86% of the globe was covered by imperial holdings, right? So 86% of the globe is either imperial centers or the empire, with the British Empire being the largest. And so effectively this fed into Zionism as well. So how do we go about creating a Jewish state? When the land is all taken, the idea became, we lobby the empires to give us some corner of their empire somewhere. And this kind of white supremacist thinking was very central to Zionist thought as well. There was this notion, if you read through any of the kind of early decades of Zionist literature, the notion of Zionist being a European white civilized movement that was going to kind of shine light into the barbaric parts of the rest of the world, Africa, Asia, the Americas, is central. You can't escape it. It's on every page. And so the question became where to create this state. And so for a few years, this debate kind of rages. There was a thought early on of it being in Patagonia. So, by the way, and we're only talking about the late 1880s into the early 1890s. So this isn't a very old story. This is barely 120 years old or so. And so there's actually a Jewish migration to Argentina, to Patagonia. There's still Jewish families in Argentina whose great grandparents moved there thinking that's where the Jewish state was going to be established. For 2 years, Herzl was in negotiations with the British Foreign Colonial Office about giving Zionism Uganda. And a whole host of other options were also sort of entertained and pitched and debated and whatnot. And they tried with all the empires, right? So even as Tsarist Russia was carrying out pogroms, there would be these delegations of Zionists coming to visit higher ups in the Tsarist regime, sometimes within days of a pogrom and a massacre of Jews, and where this is just like not even discussed, not talked about, not thought about, which actually angered a lot of Jewish radicals in Russia and in Eastern Europe, who became even more vociferously anti-Zionist because they saw the Zionists normalizing with mega anti-Semites, which would be a theme that would kind of run through this. And this is because you can see that there's a overlap in the interests of European anti-Semites and the early Zionist movement. Namely, the Zionists wanted to mobilize Jews to move out of Europe and to a place that would become the Jewish state. And anti-Semites wanted Jews out of European society. And so, for instance, here in Britain, in 1905, after a major pogrom, a set of pogroms in Eastern Europe, there was a major sort of Jewish refugee crisis. And it was none other than Lord Arthur Balfour who stood up in Parliament and effectively said, we cannot take any of these Jewish refugees into our society. So in 1897, these photos on your screen are from a congress, a meeting held in Basel, Switzerland, of the World Zionist Organization, to effectively decide on the key issue: where are we going to create this Jewish state? And this is the moment where the World Zionist Organization says we're going to create it in Palestine. And so we can sort of, if we want a starting point for the struggle, we kind of would often start here. Because after this, the World Zionist Organization effectively starts to build institutions that would become the main institutions to create this Jewish state in Palestine. The first of them is actually incorporated here in London in 1901 or 1902. It's incorporated as the Jewish National Fund, even though its Hebrew name is Keren Kayemet LeIsrael, so the Israel National Fund. And the purpose of the Jewish National Fund was to acquire land in and around what we now think of as Palestine. And the idea was to fundraise in Europe and North America and then kind of buy the land. The problem for the Jewish National Fund is very quickly after that Zionist Congress that we saw photos of, Palestinians and Arabs more broadly, began to understand that these Jewish migrants who were coming as part of the Zionist movement weren't like other groups of people who had come to live in Palestine. So Palestine, because of its geographical location and religious significance, has been for many, many centuries a place where people are constantly moving in and out. And you can see it in our complexion and our eye color and our hair and whatnot. Sometimes you'll have siblings and one will be like white and blonde and another will be much darker with curly hair. And so dark curly hair. So and Jewish people have been a part of Palestinian society and the society in Palestine for the entirety of that time. So Jewish religious kind of cycles and events were just as much a part of everybody's daily life as the Muslim and Christian ones. And so, but there was this awareness that the Zionists who were coming were not like other people who were coming, and not even like other Jews. And Jewish Palestinians were amongst some of the first to ring the alarm bell about Zionism and to say, hey, this is, you can't just come here and say like we're taking over. And remember, so there is this kind of bind that Zionism puts non-Zionist Jews in, right? So for European Jews, the idea of Zionism was to say, you are foreign here. So if you are Jewish, you can't also be British. You're somehow an outsider to Britain. Whereas for many Jews, if not most, the idea was that no, we're just as British as anybody else, but Britain needs to accept us, and Britain needs to see that we're just as British as everybody else, and the same in other places. And for Palestinian Jews, these kind of European Jews coming in with this whole talk of like we want to create a pure Jewish state was going to reflect poorly on them, and also it was going to put them in a position where, you know, that meant that their Muslim and Christian neighbors and friends were somehow not going to be welcome in the same country. So the Jewish National Fund started to face extreme resistance, and basically nobody wanted to sell them any of their land. So they had to find much sneakier ways to get at the land, but to talk about that would take too much time, but I'm happy to answer questions about that later. Just to say that by the time we reached 1947, so about 50 years of the Jewish National Fund in operation, and millions of pounds raised abroad, they only managed to take control over 6%, 6.7% of the land, leaving about 91% of the land still not under Zionist control. So it was a dismal failure in terms of acquisition of land, even though some really tricky or kind of unscrupulous methods had been used in acquiring much of this land. The second and at least as important organization is an organization called the Jewish Agency. By the way, both of these organizations, the Jewish National Fund and the Jewish Agency, are still around, and they operate as charities in over 50 countries. So in Britain, in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, etc. Taxpayer money goes to subsidize their work because they're registered as charities. The Jewish Agency's task was to move Jewish people. Again, because this was a white supremacist movement, it was really just about moving white Jewish people, so from Europe and North America to Palestine. And again, to raise funds and resources to be able to do that. Much of this work was often to go around and kind of like berate and demean Jewish people and say, like, you know, you're not Jewish if you're not moving to create this Jewish-only state. But also to create facilitation for migration. So for instance, to help with airfare, to ensure that you have a place to live, to ensure that you find work when you get there. And here they faced, just before we kind of move to the fast forward, by the end of the 1920s, the Zionist movement had only managed to move about 60 to 80,000 white Jewish people to Palestine. So it was a dismal failure. You know, if we're in 1930 and we're the Zionist movement, we've been working for 30 years with the Jewish National Fund and the Jewish Agency and all of this. We have the full support of the British occupation, and the British are actually sort of have colonized this territory or have made it part of the empire and are now facilitating Zionism as a matter of policy. And despite all of this, to have less than 6% of the land, but this tiny fraction of the population, of no more of 80,000 people, this was a far cry from being able to create an exclusively Jewish state that controlled all of its territory. The thing that really changed everything was the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany. It became patently unsafe to be Jewish in Europe, especially if you were in one of the fascist countries, especially in Germany. And so you had a massive number of Jewish people trying to keep their families safe and themselves safe and move. And what they faced was that most countries in the world and most of the countries that they were trying to move to, so Britain, the United States, Canada, and so on, closed their borders to Jewish refugees. So, to the point where in 1938, Britain and the United States host a conference in Evian in Switzerland called the Evian Congress or Evian Conference. And of course, they bill it as like how we're going to help Jewish refugees. But if you look at any of the paperwork around this Congress, and it's been studied a lot, so this, you know, this will be evident even on the Wikipedia page probably for the Evian Congress, was that the main purpose behind this was actually to kind of package how they were going to limit any sort of Jewish refugees coming in. The most important book on this for Canada, it's written by a Zionist historian, Irving Abella. And the name of the book kind of says it all. The title of the book is None is Too Many. So no Jews is too many Jews to be allowing into Canada. That's how he described Canadian policy towards Jewish refugees from the Holocaust. And so that really squeezed Jewish refugees options on where they could go. And so the Jewish Agency was managed to kind of funnel a lot of people to Palestine, even though that's not necessarily where they wanted to go. And so it was a combination of people fleeing the Holocaust, and then after 1945 and the liberation of the concentration camps and extermination camps, you had a massive population of displaced Jewish refugees who were also indigent. All of their property had been confiscated by the Nazis or destroyed. And so the Jewish Agency then started to pick able-bodied young people, primarily, who expressed sympathy with Zionism to help them, to facilitate moving them to Palestine. But despite all of this, no more than a third of the population on the eve of the 1948 Nakba was Jewish. So just over 608,000 out of a total population of around 1.9 million. And so if we're the Zionist leadership sitting together at this time, we've effectively failed. We've set out to create an exclusively Jewish state with the maximum control over territory. And we have 1/3 of the population and barely 7% of the land. And so how to create an exclusively Jewish state and take control over the territory? The answer was conquest, was military, right? So this is what Palestinians call the Nakba of 1948. It actually begins in late 1947. And in all the ways that matter, it continues until today. So the most conservative estimate is 750,000 refugees, with estimates going up to 1 million. Definitely, we're talking about 2/3 of the Palestinian population forcibly expelled and denied return. Over 13,000 Palestinians killed. So this was not a campaign, a military campaign of killing the largest number of Palestinians. It wasn't about extermination in that sense. So this wasn't necessarily a genocide. It was mass forced population transfer, major war crime. And here I just want to kind of say that when people talk about Palestine as this very complicated and complex thing, I think we need to understand that it's actually quite straightforward. What Zionism has aimed to do has been to take control over the maximum amount of land with the smallest number of Palestinians on that land, right? And that's where this idea of geography and demography is the key to kind of understanding the history of Zionist colonialism in Palestine. So the work of the Jewish National Fund, for instance, in terms of the land, and then the work of the Jewish Agency of bringing in the largest number of Jewish people to Palestine. After 1948, they begin to look for Jewish people outside of Europe and North America, and begin to bring in Eastern Jews, Mizrahi Jews, from places like Iraq and Ethiopia and Morocco and Iran and so on. And then after the establishment of the state, or in the process of the establishment of the state, it becomes about the consistent and systematic forced expulsion of Palestinians, using every means possible. So this just begins in a way, in this mass way, with the Nakba of 1948, but then doesn't stop since then. Over 530 Palestinian villages and towns destroyed and fully depopulated as part of a military plan, a military strategy called Plan Dalit that Israeli historians have effectively uncovered from the Israeli military archives. Each village usually was approached by the Zionist forces and surrounded from 3 sides, heavy artillery shelling, and the idea was to push the population towards the closest border. The army would finish that work, move in on foot. The infantry would move in to the village, occupy the space of the village. Anybody who remained in the village would be gathered into open squares. The men separated from the women and children. The women and children sent running towards the nearest border. And then the men, anybody who had been involved in the resistance in the past and so on, was executed. So there, in many cases, intentional massacres were intentionally used to terrorize nearby villages. And then the army would move on, and then another smaller unit would follow with dynamite and trucks. They'd go into the houses. Anything that was of value was loaded onto the trucks. For instance, our books are all held at the Israeli National Library and marked as absentee property. and then the houses were blown up. Every village has its own story, but this is generally the tactic that was used over 530 times. And the Palestinians who managed to survive this alive and who were displaced ended up being the Palestinian refugee population, the longest standing refugee population in the world right now. The largest number of Palestinian refugees are in Jordan. The highest density of Palestinian refugees are in the Gaza Strip. So when we talk about the Gaza Strip, we have to always remember that over 2/3 of the Gaza Strip's population are refugees, all living within a 20-minute drive of the towns and villages from which their families were displaced in 1948. They and their families were displaced in 1948. Many of them ended up in the West Bank, and so the West Bank has this kind of dual character where you have a very large refugee population, and then on top of that, an occupation, a military occupation, as was the case with the Gaza Strip until not too long ago. This is the Baqa refugee camp in Jordan in the 1950s. This is almost the same. This is almost the same kind of view today. After 1948, people said that effectively the work of the Jewish National Fund was done. It didn't need to exist anymore. But then they came up with another way to use the Jewish National Fund. The Jewish National Fund, in its charter when it was founded in London, there's two very important bylaws. One is that the purpose of the Jewish National Fund is to acquire land in the name of the Jewish people in perpetuity, so forever. And two, that any land that comes under Jewish National Fund control must only be used for exclusive Jewish settlement. And so after 1948, in the early 1950s, the Israeli parliament passed a series of laws that effectively offloaded decision-making as pertaining to the land that the state controlled in Israel, so 93% of the land, offloaded the decision-making of that effectively to the Jewish National Fund. And so this is a lot of how Israeli apartheid actually works. Unlike in South Africa, where there was this very clear delineation of what are the races and what are the different entitlements and laws, kind of how you have different laws for different groups of people. The way Israel does it is a lot smarter, to be honest. They effectively, if you read the laws, you can't tell that it's a racist law. You just find a law that says, the basic law, JNF, basically says that there's kind of this offloading of responsibility on things pertaining to land, to what's called Israel Lands, to something called the Israel Lands Authority. Then you have to go look at the Israel Lands Authority, and you find out that the Jewish National Fund appoints the plurality of its directors. And then you have to go look at the Jewish National Fund's bylaws to see that the Jewish National Fund is legally mandated to be a racist organization. Any land coming under its control being used exclusively for exclusive Jewish settlement. The other thing that the Jewish National Fund did was it rebranded as an environmentalist organization. So what it did was a large chunk, what's shaded in yellow here on the map, was transferred over to not the Israel Lands Authority that the Jewish National Fund sort of appoints directors to, but to the Jewish National Fund directly. And then the land that the Jewish National Fund controls, it uses for the most part as national parks. And so what it does is it plants European pine trees on the sites of the destroyed Palestinian villages. So if any of you ever visit 48 Palestine, you can go to any national park, and if you're paying attention, and you don't have to pay too much attention, you'll see it. You'll see the remnants of Palestinian agriculture. So you'll see fruit trees and trees that don't grow wild, and cactus, which is very hard to uproot, which Palestinians used often as property markers to mark like their property from their neighbors. But you will also see the remains of homes that were dynamited in the 1948 Nakba. Now, after 1948, this is the southern half of Palestine. So to orient you, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but at the top right of the map, that's kind of the West Bank in yellow. And then over here, we have the Gaza Strip on the top left of the map beside the Mediterranean Sea. 115,000 Palestinians lived in this area we see on the map, the the southern half of Palestine before 1948. Between 1948 and 1953, Israel expelled over 90,000 of them. The remaining 15,000 all got squeezed into this white shaded area here. This is a zoom in of that area. And in 1960, and I'm going to focus on this area because it's really like, if you can get what I'm about to say here, you can understand what Israel's been doing to Palestinians everywhere under its control. So in 1965, Israel passed one of its most important laws, a law called the Planning and Construction Law. If you read, it's a very big law. If you read this law, it's just extremely boring and nothing looks racist about it because it's a zoning law. It effectively says, here we're going to have an archaeological site, a commercial area, a road, a school. But what's interesting about this law is that it's comprehensive. So it says it's listing all of the communities that exist in Israel. What that actually means is that any community not listed, so any village or town that's not listed, doesn't exist. So as soon as this law was passed, dozens of Palestinian villages ceased to officially exist, which means they don't appear on any Israeli official maps, but it also means no electricity, no water, no sewage, no clinics, no healthcare. And it also means that any building or any kind of construction, if you put a few bricks on top of each other, that's an illegal construction. You can't get zoning for that. You can't get permission for that because the village doesn't exist. All of the blue dots and green blobs that you see on this map, these are unrecognized villages. So these are villages that were not listed in the 1965 law. And there's a few dozen of them in the north, in the Galilee as well. I'm going to focus on these. So all of the Palestinians who lived in these villages, effectively their homes became illegal and they couldn't have any kind of public infrastructure. Okay. And so but what's important here is that what happened is beginning in 1968, between 1968 and 1981, Israel recognized 7 of the villages. So those are the green blobs here. So Rahat, Lajiyeh, Hurat, Al-Saba, and so on. And what's interesting about this is that the strategy here became to create zones where Palestinians could legally exist in an easily controllable and isolatable way, to then enable making the rest of the land area where Palestinians could be forcibly transferred off of and displaced from. And so this is that maximum land under exclusive Zionist control with minimum Palestinians on that land. Flipped on its head, it's the maximum number of Palestinians on the minimum amount of land. And that's effectively the strategy for the elimination of Palestinian presence. Or kind of concentration of Palestinian presence, but as part of an ideology that aims to effectively, ultimately eliminate us from being able to be there at all. Because I'm limited on time, I wanted to talk about one of these villages, but I just want to kind of range ahead. So here, anyway, I'm just going to range ahead to talk about how this ends up being sort of brought into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, it needed a new kind of strategy. There were too many Palestinians who remained. About 400,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled beyond the borders of of Palestine in 1967. And but it still left hundreds of thousands of Palestinians within what we now think of as the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And so the initial military strategy for how to deal with this new occupied population was to split it into 3 big kind of blobs of territory. So the northern West Bank, the southern West Bank, and the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And the idea was that this was mostly going to be done using sort of military infrastructure and military personnel. Over the course of the 70s, this is recognized to be too expensive and not very sustainable. And so Ariel Sharon becomes one of the key architects of how to modify the Alon Plan using Israeli civilian population. And so the idea becomes for the Israeli civilian population to be incentivized to move into the West Bank and Gaza Strip and take the strategic locations that would split Palestinian communities apart thereby beginning the process of creating these kind of concentration zones where Palestinians could legally live, and to expropriate and forcibly transfer any remaining Palestinians from the rest of the land. And the linchpin to this was to find Palestinians like the Bantustan administrations in South Africa, so people who are of the native population who would be willing to be empowered by the colonial authority to act as the government on behalf of the kind of fake government on behalf of the colonial power. And so the hunt began for Palestinians who were willing to act as Israel's first line of defense, as Israel's police force. And there was so I did my master's dissertation on this initiative. It was called the Village Leagues. And it was implemented beginning in the late 70s, but really in the early 1980s. And it barely lasted a year because there was a massive Palestinian uprising to say, no, the only people who represent us are the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. And so over the course of the 80s, the Israeli strategy kind of switched to how do we make the PLO our native administration? And that's effectively what the peace process and the Oslo Peace Accords were, was taking the Sharon plan and making the PLO responsible, and especially the right-wing faction within the PLO called Fatah and headed by Yasser Arafat, to make that, to create something called the Palestinian Authority, and for the Palestinian Authority to come in as a police force and an administrator to reduce the cost of the occupation. And better than that, actually, in this case, it was also an internationally funded, right? So the PA doesn't really have any kind of income generation. It's mostly reliant on external funding from other countries, like the UK and Japan and the US and Saudi Arabia and so on. And so basically Israel is kind of a stroke of a masterful stroke, because they offloaded all of the expenses of the occupation itself to the international community. And they now had Palestinians there to police the rest of the Palestinian population and as you can see from the map, these concentration zones. So the same kind of logic that we saw in the south, in the Nakba, being implemented in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where, so for Palestinians, the majority of the Palestinian population in the West Bank is meant to be concentrated in these peach-colored areas. This is what's called Area A under the Oslo agreements. These are the cities. And then Area B is the areas which under Oslo were supposed to become Area A, but that was never really going to happen, which has sort of some of the more density of villages. And then over half of the West Bank is just simply expropriated and taken as part of the settlement. So these are technically in Israeli law, Area C, which is again over half of the West Bank, is zoned as the municipal area of the settlements. And it was the same in the Gaza Strip until 2005, when it was, I think it cost the Israeli state 4 soldiers to protect 1 settler. And so in 2005, there was this thing called that they called the disengagement, which was really a withdrawal, a military withdrawal from the Gaza Strip because of the resistance, as a response to the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip, and the transformation of the Gaza Strip from being like the West Bank, a series of chopped up Bantustans, to one big concentration camp, the world's largest open-air prison up until recently, when it turned into the world's largest extermination camp. And you can see the kind of, so just to kind of come back to this map of South Africa, right? So we have that kind of almost identical logic being used. So a native authority on a concentrated population. The major difference being that in the case of South Africa, these big concentration zones were meant to be warehousing to enable very cheap workforce as well as control over the native population. In the case of Palestine, what we're seeing now in Gaza really kind of confirms that the idea is to have us in easily controllable concentration camps, because the West Bank is a series of concentration camps and Gaza was one major one. But then as of October 7th becomes a site of an extermination camp. So how do we get rid of the Palestinians? And now going into overdrive, and now a very real fear of the West Bank, that exactly what's happening in the Gaza Strip is now going to be enacted on the Bantustans, on the concentration camps of the West Bank. and a very real fear for those Palestinians who managed to remain within Israel after 1948 and become Palestinian citizens of Israel, who account for about 20% of the Israeli citizen population, that they're next as well, that they would be forcibly expelled as well. And that's very much what Israeli leaders and public figures talk about. I think my time is up. I just want to give you sort of one little example here. This is Qalqilia, a town in Palestine. Qalqilia sits on one of the largest underground water aquifers in the entire country. For about 3,000 or 4,000 years, Qalqilia has exported fruits and vegetables to the rest of the region. This wall was completed in 2003, 2004. This photo is from back then. There is none of this agricultural land anymore. This is all built up. Qalqilia has one door. There's one entry and exit way. The rest is all wall. One Israeli soldier can shut down Qalqilia and turn it from a town to a prison in a matter of minutes. And this is the case, so Qalqilia is particular because there's only one entry and exit, but every Palestinian town in the West Bank, like the Gaza Strip, has a set from 2 to 5 or 6 or 7 entry and exit points, and the rest is all controlled and closed. So before October 7th, this is effectively what the Gaza Strip looked like as well. It was not just the infrastructure of the wall enclosing the Gaza Strip, it was also a kind of like very large space of no-go zone with kind of motion detector, machine guns, and a place of great danger, right? And just a squeezing of the population into a more and more densely packed population with all of the things that comes with, right? So illnesses. And in the case of Gaza, as of 2007, this open-air prison was put under siege, was shut down under a blockade that allowed very little in and banned things as random as ballpoint pens and pasta, and where the population has been struggling to survive on what was called the Israelis basically had a doctrine where regarding the Gaza blockade, which was to count how many calories are necessary to keep a human being alive per day and multiply that by the population of Gaza and allow only that many calories to enter the Gaza Strip. Again, since 2017, so we're talking about 16 years. But even if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, it's the same kind of logic that you'll face. So those areas that have a high Palestinian density, so we've already seen the south, that yellow shaded area in the south, but the highest Palestinian density is in the north, in the Galilee, where you see the green. And though you don't see a wall or settlements here, these Palestinian villages are operating in a similar kind of spatial logic. I visited this home. So across the valley over there is al-Fahim, a very densely packed Palestinian city. This man had saved up for about 30 years to build a family home on land that he had title to. The Israeli police and military saw him building the home. They waited until he finished, moved the family in, and then issued him with an eviction or a demolition order and destroyed his house. Just because it's outside of the designated concentration zone for Palestinians. Just as a kind of final word, a reminder that Israel, we can, even if you sort of start to think of Israel as this quite a criminal state, a criminal endeavor, we need to also recognize that it's very much tightly bound to a set of alliances with European and North American countries, as well as India, Australia, and so on, and particularly other settler colonies. And that this is not just a diplomatic friendship. This includes like very tight imbrication of economies and a massive arms trade, right? So all of the only thing that enables Israel to continue to be a racist apartheid state and now a genocidal state is international support, is the fact that some of the most powerful states in the international system back it almost blindly. To the point where now, even in the last 5 months, even a call for a ceasefire has been treated as this kind of radical, rabid demand. But the other thing to be aware of is that as Israel is allowed to get away with certain practices, it normalizes it for the international community. So it becomes a model. So for instance, after the sort of launch of the war on terror and the kind of rabid anti-Islamic feeling after the September 11th attacks, Israel began to be, for example, treated as the place that knows how to deal with terrorism. And so police forces in the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and other European countries have all sent their police forces to be trained by Israeli military. And now we're seeing increased militarization of police and increasing militarization of police tactics in the countries of the West, for instance. A reminder that, as you know, through what I've shown you in this presentation, there is no such thing as a two-state solution. There is that's not a solution. That is apartheid. So the way that apartheid is being marketed to the world is as a two-state solution, because the Palestinian state in this story is effectively a set of concentration camps and an extermination camp, and a set of concentration camps that at any minute can become extermination camps. And this is very important to note, that this is very much a reality that our families are dealing with right now. You know, I haven't put much time. I know that people are following the news, and if you have questions, you can feel free to ask them. But the last 5 months, what we've seen is a systematic destruction of anything that can allow life in the Gaza Strip. I mean, just the poisoning of the ground through the amount of munitions and explosives dropped into it. But then you know, destruction of hospitals, the targeting, especially of anything regarding women's health and child care and early infancy and so on. I think I've probably gone over time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to the discussion and your questions.
Hazem, thanks so much for that. That was really informative. We've got 2 questions that have come in by the Q&A box that we have. The first one is from Daisy, and she asks, how did the international community and global governments respond to the Nakba?
That's a very interesting question, and I think one deserving of more research. The United Nations has just been born, sends a special envoy, a man who was a Swedish aristocrat called Count Folke Bernadotte, who had risen to some prominence because he had helped many Jews escape the Holocaust. And the Zionist militia in Palestine assassinated him. You had the passing of UN Resolution 194 upon a lot of it coming from his recommendation. So on December 10th, 1948, you have the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which includes a very clear statement about every human has the right to return to their country. That's actually very much occasioned by the forced expulsions. And then on the next day, UN General Assembly Resolution 194 that demands the return of all the Palestinian refugees and restitution of any of the properties that were taken or destroyed, and compensation for the damages done to Palestinian refugees. This was not implemented, obviously. The United Nations then set up 2 agencies. They set up, so in international speak, you have, when it comes to refugees, you have something called protection and something called assistance. Protection is kind of the politics, is the implementation of rights. So for instance, the right to return, that's part of protection. It's actually the only part of protection that is a right. Whereas assistance is sort of enabling people to live. So education, healthcare, and employment usually, and housing. And so there are 2 institutions under the UN that are set up. One is called the United Nations Conciliation Commission on Palestine, or the UNCCP. That's supposed to do the protection bit. Israel sits on this. The United States sat on it. It still exists on paper. The Israelis just kept stopping any of the proceedings and objecting to things, to the point where the other delegates said, there's just no point wasting our time. Like, we can't get anything done in this. So it exists formally, and I think the last time they met formally was maybe in 1953 or 1954. The second agency that was established was one called the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, so UNRWA. And that was supposed to just do the work of assistance. So basically to register Palestinian refugees, set up these refugee camps that a lot of them before that were kind of assistance was being provided by independent organizations like the Quakers or even the Red Cross. So this set up the formal Palestinian refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and then some coordination with Iraq and Egypt. And effectively sets up schools, clinics, tries to provide jobs, and kind of built the initial wave of buildings that became the homes, initially tents, and then these sort of housing units that have now people have built on top of and whatnot in the refugee camps. It then, I mean, over the first 20 years of the Nakba, you basically have the beginnings of the split in the international community of where you stand on Palestine, right? Palestine as the litmus for what kind of state are you. The first country to recognize Israel was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union played an extremely destructive role in Arab societies for the most part. And then the other major backer of Israel, of course, was Britain, who promised the creation of a Jewish, or support for the creation of a Jewish state in the Balfour Declaration in 1917. But then increasingly the United States, so basically, which has also played, both Britain and the United States have played incredibly destructive roles and continue to play incredibly destructive roles in our region. So I hope I've answered the question, but that was, you basically have this big, this is one of the 3 issues on the docket for the very first meeting of the United Nations. It's this, Kashmir, and Cyprus. I think all 3 issues, but particularly this one, you begin to see the international rift between the anti-colonial, recently emerged from colonialism states and the imperial powers, mostly kind of Europe and its settler colonies that it created in the rest of the world. And so that's been the international response.
Thank you so much for that. We've got another question from Jane, and she's talking, I think, referencing the blockade of Gaza, and she's saying, what about the ocean access of Gaza? Are no imports allowed from there? And if
Sorry,
not, why
say
not?
that again? I can't find it.
She said, what about the ocean access to Gaza? Are no imports allowed from there? And if not, why not?
Oh, so when the Israelis imposed the blockade on Gaza in 2007, of course, this was part of the infrastructure of occupation before that. It just became much more severe. That fourth wall, let's say, the Gaza's coastline, is very heavily policed by the Israeli Navy. Palestinian fishermen are regularly shot at, and if any of you ever go to Palestine and see, one of the things that will strike you is the randomness, is that you don't know if the checkpoint's going to be open today. You don't know if there's going to be if the soldier staffing something you need to pass is going to be in a good mood or a bad mood. With the fishermen, they don't know on any given day how many miles they'll be allowed out off the coastline. So maybe today you're safe 2 kilometers out, but tomorrow you go to the exact same spot and you get shot at by the Israeli Navy. So, but definitely that's a heavily patrolled coastline.
We also have another question from Jane, and she's asking, well, what do the Palestinians want? Is your idea that all the Israelis be replaced by Palestinians? What is it that you're proposing as the alternative?
No, the Palestinian movement no part of the Palestinian movement ever demanded some kind of like mass forced removal of Jewish people in Palestine. Again, Jewish presence is integral to Palestine. That's a big part of our history and our society. One of the major crimes of Zionism is that it estranged us from our Jewish neighbors and family members. And not just us, Jewish Arabs in general have had their identities so complicated by Zionism because it put them in this position where there's some kind of foreign implant when they're very much a part of our societies. It's the European colonists who were the foreign implant. And European migrants and visitors were always part of, also, whether Christian or Jewish or otherwise, were also always part of who was coming into Palestine and becoming part of the social fabric by marrying in and having children and so on. What we want is, we want an end to the occupation. We want to live with dignity. We want our land back. And we want, like, to, places need to have their names back. We need to sort of undo what Zionism has done. We need to end Zionism. And we need to kind of recreate a Jewish localness to our region that's not complicated by colonial ideology. So we want to be able to live as neighbors again.
We have another question from Katriana. Sorry if I've mispronounced that. They've asked, what can we do? I've joined marches in Leeds. We don't buy Israeli goods. I've responded to ceasefire petitions, and just this week wrote a long letter to my MP, but I feel helpless.
Well, you're not helpless. You did all those things, and you can keep doing them, and all of them are useful. Continue to educate yourself and others is also very, very useful. And see what other parts of your life intersect, right? So this is, I mean, one thing about how interconnected our societies are is that you begin to find where you find social struggles in against, for example, policing and incarceration, you find that, like, the Israelis have helped train the prison police, so all of these things end up being very, very connected. So find out more about how support for Zionism is sort of embroiled in your life. There is, for instance, we boycott the Israeli avocados and dates, but then what about talking to the shop owners and having a campaign in your neighborhood, talking to the shop owners to stop stocking them, and to then talk to their distributors about, like, we don't want this anymore, give me some other dates and avocados. There's also a large range of kind of more direct action activities that people have taken, such as blockading arms companies, and just making it business as usual more difficult to do, to say, hey, this is not normal. You can't behave normally with someone actively committing genocide right in front of us. But I think educating yourself, educating others, the work you're already doing it more systematically and bringing more people into it, and doing the work of finding out how else that, if you are going to, if you're, we all have things like some group of people we play football with, or a group of people that we have a reading group with, or so on. Kind of like bring this into those sort of spaces and see what kinds of creative energies and ideas come up. I found out that the water coolers at my workplace is an Israeli company called Eden Springs. And now we're trying to campaign to just get, and they bottle their water in the Golan Heights in the occupied Syria. So, like, there's no water in Britain that we can be drinking. We have to bring the water from an apartheid genocide regime for us to drink, and bottled in, like, territory that the UK itself recognizes as occupied territory. But you find this, at work also. They issue us with HP computers. HP provides the Israeli military with much of its tech hardware. The military, not just some part of the state or something. The Israeli military. We see HP like at the checkpoints and on the tanks and stuff. So how is this the contract that we still have? These are the kinds of contracts that need to be stopped until these companies break their contracts with the genocidal regime in Tel Aviv.
Thank you. That was really insightful. We have another question from Reinhard, who's asked, why does Egypt cooperate with Israel in the blockade of Gaza?
Well, I mean, the shortest answer to this is the United States. So Egypt is a brutal military dictatorship that came to power through a counter-revolution against the only democratically elected leader Egypt has had, with all of the misgivings around that leader. It depends so much on the United States for what political scientists call geopolitical rent, right? So it effectively Egypt and Israel both get billions of dollars in aid. Israel, of course, gets, I think, 1.5 times more, and now, exponentially more. But Israel gets about $3 billion a year from the United States, and Egypt gets $2 billion. Much of this goes into military and prison and policing. But the Egyptian regime is effectively a U.S. puppet regime, and does U.S. bidding, and has a very kind of strange relationship with Israel, quite directly, right? They were the first Arab country to normalize with Israel back in 1979, and that normalization has become very much part of the Egyptian sort of deep state security establishment. Not that they're completely allies in any sense, but that the Egyptians won't go against an order from Washington that says keep that border closed, or don't allow aid in, actually, is what I should say. Yeah.
Thank you.
And by the way, I really also need to say, since in the last few months, as people have been trying to get loved ones out and raising a lot of money, maybe you've seen some of these crowd funding initiatives. Egypt is basically cashing in on the genocide. Like, not only are they enabling and participating in the genocide, they're now found a way to monetize the genocide by forcing Palestinians in Gaza who want to get out to pay into Egyptian coffers thousands of pounds for the chance of being able to cross into Egypt, right? So, and since most of the money in Gaza has already been sucked away or destroyed or stolen by Israeli soldiers and so on, this is money that now has to be raised from abroad. So once again, these regimes are effectively funneling international money into their own coffers, using people trying to survive the genocide. It is mind-boggling. I don't understand. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We've got a question from Mike, where he's asked, how cohesive is Israel? What internal tensions and contradictions exist, given that there were mass strikes against Netanyahu's power grab of the law? Has this war brought Israelis together as oppressors, or opened up deeper cracks in the apartheid state?
A bit of all of the above, to be honest. So the Israeli society at this point, because this wasn't necessarily always the case, but at this point, Israeli society is united by a common enemy, which in reality is kind of its own conscience of the crimes that enabled this society to exist in the way it currently exists. So this Palestinian boogeyman is this common enemy. This also siege mentality of everybody's out to get us is actually a very strong glue in Israeli society. That's just a given. That's across the board of the political spectrum in Israel, especially the dominant political spectrum. There is no question that Palestinians are this inferior species that is a problem, is a security problem on the kind of progressive end of this very radically right-wing constellation of political forces, and that needs to be exterminated in its entirety as far as the far right wing is concerned. And when we talk about the far right wing, usually we talk about fringe groups. In the case of Israeli politics, the far right holds the key ministries, and in many ways the prime ministership. There are massive rifts within Israeli society, but those rifts do not really pertain to Palestinians or the treatment of, the dealing with, and so on. There's a consensus on ultimately Palestinians are the enemy. Arabs are the enemy, Muslims are the enemy, including those who are citizens of the state, by the way. It's just to what degree. The big rifts and the protests are things around like corruption, democracy, religiosity versus secularism, class rifts, ethnic and religious rifts. You have, for example, when I say Jewish in this presentation, I don't actually mean the Jewish religion. I mean Jewish as defined by Israeli law, because that's a legal category in Israel. And so you have about 1 million people who came in the 90s after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and many of them were not Jewish. They were Christian. They were Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Christian, but they found out that if they could get a rabbi to write a kind of certify Jewishness, if they could forge themselves as Jews, then through the Israeli law of return, they were automatically given Israeli citizenship. So that was a way to escape the Soviet Union. But then as soon as they got their papers, they were fine being Christian again. So you can go to all these places in the Galilee where there are Russian Orthodox churches, but if you go and ask anyone to see their ID card, you'll see that they're registered as Jewish. So they're legally Jewish, just confessionally they're Christian. So you have rifts like that, like the Russians, stuff like that. But as far as the indigenous population is concerned, the settler society enjoys way too much privilege and has been given way too much impunity for 75 years to do whatever it wants with no accountability whatsoever. And so there's not even this incentive to think, oh, like maybe we shouldn't commit a genocide. If you see the kind of polls coming out of Israel, it's mortifying. 5 months into just houses being destroyed on top of people's heads and the destruction of life and what enables life, you have like 65+% of the population saying like we need to like bomb Rafah, where all that remains of the this massive amount of Gaza's population being concentrated not down near the border. So I know, I mean, most of my Jewish Israeli friends are very strongly anti-Zionist, and almost none of them still live in Palestine. They all live abroad now. Even if I knew them when they lived there, by now, it's not a comfortable place for them. They feel, that they're complicit in things like apartheid and genocide, which they don't want to do, but then their years of trying to fight against this has felt for them like bashing their heads against a brick wall. And ultimately they end up leaving. And what we're left with, and so you go to Berlin or New York or London, you'll find a lot of anti-Zionist Jews, some of whom are Israeli. But you go to Palestine, and it's much more difficult to find them. And if they are there, right now especially, it's much more difficult for them to speak. And we get news every once in a while about someone daring to say something almost mild and then like losing their job, and pundits getting on the media and saying they should be lynched and things like this, right? So it's patently unsafe also for Jewish people who want to object to this, which is a hallmark of fascism. So in some ways, you want to kind of put your hope in some kind of like Jewish Israeli kind of waking up, the part of the Jewish Israeli society waking up and saying, no, not in our name, we can't do this anymore. But then you try to find where that is, and you see just how much they're up against and just how few of them are still left in the country.
Thank you for that. That was really comprehensive. We have received another question from Ruth, and she asks, is it correct that when the UN recognized a new Jewish state in 1948, surrounding Arab countries invaded?
I mean, that's not exactly how that timeline works. So November 1947, the United Nations passes Resolution 181, which recommends the partition of Palestine into a Jewish majority state and an Arab majority state, but giving people the choice which state they want to live in. So unlike with partition unlike with other partition resolutions where they literally called things, this kind of state, that kind of state. In this one, people were in the resolution itself given the choice which state they wanted to be citizens of. The Zionist leadership took that as enough international legitimacy to put into reality, to make reality the exclusive Zionist Israel that they had in mind. And so beginning in December 1947, they begin the systematic forced expulsion of Palestinians. By May 1948, well over 300,000 Palestinians have already been expelled, right? So over half, I mean, depending on how many, we'll never know how many was the total number, but well over 300,000 of us had already been forcibly expelled by midnight on the night of May 14th, beginning of May 15th, the Zionist leadership declares Israel an independent state. And so that officially begins this war where the Arab states nearby invade. By the way, we should also note, like when we talk about Arab countries invading, it might sound like this ominous thing. And of course, on some level, it was, but let's keep in mind that the main Arab armies, so Iraq and Jordan, that had any training and equipment, were under Jordanian military leadership, and the Jordanian king had already cut a deal with the Zionist leadership on where their borders would be. They just couldn't agree on Jerusalem, and so Jerusalem was the only place where there was like actual fighting of that kind from the Jordanian front. Lebanon and Syria were still under French colonial control, and so their armies, I mean, it wasn't a very scary entry of Arab armies from the north. And the Egyptian army that came in was so poorly prepared that one of the few surviving units that came back, the soldiers who came back, who were stationed in Fallujah in Palestine, immediately set about to organize a coup against the Egyptian monarchy out of their anger for having been sent in with such little preparedness, right? So just kind of keep in perspective that Israeli narrative of David versus Goliath, when you're talking about the state that's being backed by the British Empire, the most powerful empire at the time, and has US backing and even Soviet backing, as being supplied with arms, has been trained by the British military, both those fighters who were there in the 30s, who became the Jewish police that were used to clamp down on the uprising of 1936, or the Jewish brigades who the British military trained to fight in Europe and then kind of came to Palestine in order to be the fighting force. So between these two things are the backbone of what would become the Israeli military. So just revisit. It's worth revisiting some of the widely held assumptions that were pushed, and you know, you don't even have to take my word for it. Like, go read Israeli historians, go read Ilan Pappé, even the rabidly Zionist Benny Morris. He's still on some level, you know, Benny Morris writes this book about the creation of the Palestinian refugee issue or problem, he calls it, and he you know, he's honest enough that he's conveying what he's seeing in the archival material. Some things he's interpreting as a Zionist, as he would, but then his takeaway from this is that, like, the main mistake that we committed was we didn't finish the job, right? But you can still read him for the facts, and just see that this was a slaughter. This was not an even match. This was a military against effectively ragtag forces and an organized force that had already cut a deal, was already in cahoots with the people who were expelling us.
Thank you for that. That was really comprehensive. We've got, I think, 6 minutes left, so I'm just going to take two more questions. One of them you've kind of alluded to before. It's from Mona, and she says, were there or are there many Palestinian Jews, and how are they treated?
Well, I don't know how many people identify as Palestinian Jews anymore. I know with the young generation, I've met a few people, and I don't know how representative this is, but they're trying to reclaim that identity of Palestinian Jewishness for themselves. So they may have mixed ancestry, but will have like one or more grandparents who were Palestinian Jews, and they're trying to reclaim that. But they, you know, they are accepted just fine as Jewish Israelis, but then it's their political views, those same political views, that make them want to adopt a Palestinian Jewish identity rather than a Jewish Israeli Zionist identity. So an anti-Zionist act of claiming a Jewish Palestinianness. The politics that underlie that are an anti-Zionist politics, and anti-Zionist politics get you in trouble in Israel. So they get in trouble in Israel for their politics, but they can be just fine if they can kind of be assimilationist, you know, if they can just sort of hide their political views, they can get by. But if they're stating those views, then they're going to face backlash, which is not an excuse not to do it. It's just a reality of how they have to also be strategic and be very much thinking about what this means. There's another kind of parallel movement, especially for Jewish Israelis from kind of Iraqi, Moroccan, Tunisian backgrounds, whose parents or grandparents migrated in the 50s and 60s, who are trying to reclaim an Arab identity. And I don't know, so far a lot of what I've seen from that is not necessarily questioning Zionism. It's just trying to reclaim Arabic and music, and in some cases it's actually quite appropriative It's like appropriate Arab culture because I have this grandmother who was from Morocco, but then not question the Zionism, which I think some further thinking is needed on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hazem. This has been really, really informative. I'm just going to hand over now to James, who wants to just talk about an event that's happening with Global Justice Now. So over to you, James.
Yeah, thanks, Hareem, and thanks, Hazem. That was really, really great, and I can see lots of comments in the chat that are echoing that as well. So thanks for that really engaged session. I just wanted to mention, you probably, well, first of all, there was a question, I think, which was, will there be a recording available? We have been recording it. We'll try and make that available as soon as we can, because I think it will be a useful education tool, actually, for other people that weren't able to make it. I just wanted to mention also that Global Justice Now, I think Hareem mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but we've been running a petition to try and suspend the arms trade between the UK and Israel. So do sign that on our website if you haven't already. And so we're doing some campaigning work around that. We've also brought together a letter with some other NGOs, quite big NGOs, calling for a suspension of the kind of broader trade, more or less, the UK-Israel association agreement. So that's some of the work that we're trying to do from our kind of using our expertise around sort of economic issues to try and put pressure on Israel. I also wanted to just mention on a week on Saturday, we're part of this coalition event in London. So if you're in or around London, you might want to come along. Oh yes, thanks, Izzy, for posting the arms trade action in the chat there. I've just posted the event. There's several Palestinian speakers, including Ahmed Abathur from the Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq speaking. But more broadly, the event is about talking about like the question of internationalism in the sort of times we're living under, drawing some links and hopefully solidarities between different struggles for human rights and democracy around the world, and thinking about what what the tasks for internationalists are really in this kind of moment when we're also seeing the rise of this kind of scary rise of far-right parties in various places, the prospect of Trump being re-elected and so on. Yeah, did think about coming along to that as well. But thanks again. Yeah. I think we'll leave it there, will we? You're on mute, Hareem.
Sorry, we're just going to close off the event now, but yeah. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. And we are hoping to do more events, so just keep a lookout on our website and also your emails as well. Thank you.